Our Rockwell visiting artist in January is Geoffrey Detrani. This exhibit is also sponsored by the Andrew Hemingway Memorial Fund. Andy attended Taft and began his love affair with art, which continued under Joseph Albers for a year at Yale. He was a lifelong learner, looking and painting his whole life. Two of Andy's children are alums of Taft, and Mrs. Hemingway, when Andy died, set up a program in his honor and to fund an exhibit each year in the Potter Gallery. Geoffrey Detrani is an artist and a poet from New Haven. He received a BA in philosophy from the State University of New York, an MS in education from Long Island University, and an MFA in fine arts from the State University of New York. His pictures seem to be calligraphy in flux, or maybe exploding landscapes. They're quiet and full of noise. They suggest whispers and fire alarms at the same time. He's the recipient of many awards and fellowships. His work has been acquired by the New Britain Museum of American Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Baltimore Contemporary Museum, and other institutions, as well as private collectors. Please welcome Geoffrey Detrani.
Thank you, Luetta. Thank you for that lovely introduction. When I heard you speaking of my past accomplishments, I had to think for a second and think, was that me? And actually it was. When I heard the Museum of Modern Art, that's always sort of a stunning sort of thing for an artist to have. In fact, it was my books that they collected. I made at one point some artist books, and they incorporated a couple of them into their collection, and I'm proud of that. And the Schenectady Museum in New York also has some of my work. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for showing up. I want to thank the Taft School for inviting me to show my work in the Mark Potter Gallery, which is a really fantastic space. I hope everyone has been there to see shows, and I hope you can see mine. The high ceilings and the wood floor and the lighting give it a real museum feel, and it's a real asset to the school to have that. And the view through the glass doors towards the Gothic style window outside is an added bonus. Pretty amazing. And thank you for inviting me to speak at morning meeting. I'm going to apologize for speaking from notes. I don't have what I'm going to say really memorized, so it is what it is. When Luetta asked me if I might speak to the students, I thought that was a feature of being a Rockwell visiting artist. I thought that's no problem. She said 15 or 20 minutes, talk about whatever you like. I thought, I'll visit a painting and drawing class, talk with the students about my work, take a look at what they're doing, give some feedback, offer a critique, some words of encouragement, and suggest some artists to look at, etc. Sort of like a visiting artist kind of thing. Or I thought maybe I'll meet with a class in the gallery, where we'd be able to see my work right there, and talk about the images and composition and process and the myriad choices that artists have to make before, during, and after the process of making an artwork. Besides, I work with teenagers every day in my day job, so I thought no problem. Then I found out I'd be speaking at morning meeting, a school-wide event in an auditorium with a microphone and projection screen and all the trappings of a real presentation space. And I got a little more thoughtful about my presumptions about what I was doing. So then I did what probably we all do when we're lacking sufficient information and when we need context clues and reference points. I went to the world's great ethereal brain. I Googled Taft morning meeting. And then the floodgates opened up for me. There I saw real documentary evidence of other past speakers, among them at least 2 astronauts, Tibetan monks, cybersecurity experts, activists, scholars, journalists, authors, a former New York Times columnist, an admiral, and a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In fact, I think the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as the chairman of Fox News, just to name a few, and your teachers and other staff members. So this is impressive company. So I want to try to be fitting in that accomplished company and just give you some insight into why I do what I do and give you something to think about, hopefully. I don't want to talk too much about my process because that might be arcane and too technical. I don't want to give a rundown of my personal artistic history as illustrated by various artworks I made along the way because that might be a bit too self-referential for what we need to do here. But I do want to take the opportunity of this talk to briefly tell you something about myself as an artist and make a couple of points about meaning and metaphor and motivation in my work and in my thinking as an artist. So obviously I'm here as a visual artist. I do, as Louetta's introduction indicated, I do other things as well. None of us are single-faceted. We all do multiple things. But I'm here because my artworks are hanging in the Mark Potter Gallery, so I'll focus on that. So let me start with this image of my work so you have something to look at while I speak. And of course, the work is up, this piece is up in the gallery right now. And it actually, thankfully it looks better in real life than it does in reproduction here. And I think it looks great in the gallery. Louetta did a great job helping with the installation and lighting the show. And I hope you all have a chance to visit the gallery. And the opening, by the way, is tomorrow evening from 5 to 7, and there's food and all that stuff. So please come by if you can and talk to me there, ask me questions if you have any, or here at the end. So I chose this piece to start with because I think it's one of my favorite pieces, certainly among the works in the show. And really, when you work as an artist, you're always self-editing. You're always self-correcting and rethinking how you view what you do. It's a constant feedback loop within yourself. And sometimes work doesn't have staying power for you. Sometimes it loses its potency and it loses its appeal. And you go back to it after a little while and you look at it and it's not the same. But this piece actually has continued to meet my satisfaction. So, in fact, all the works in the show do. If they didn't, I wouldn't let them out of the studio after a while. Can we have the second slide, please? Since we're here at a school, I just also want to let you know that I'm also a teacher. I teach high school. I work at Alternative Public High School in New Haven, a very small school, inner city high school, and I work with students in grade 9 through 12, so similar to yourselves. Besides that day job, I'm also a professional working artist. I have exhibitions, solo and group, every year. I was the recipient of a Connecticut Artist Fellowship in 2012, which is a good, nice honor. I have been an artist in residence in several settings in Vermont, in New Mexico, and probably most memorably for me, in the former World Trade Center in New York City, the Twin Towers. In the year 2000, I was one of a group of artists who were accepted into a very special artist residency program in New York. And being an artist in residence in New York City isn't that unique. What was special about this was that the studio space I was given was on the 91st floor of one of the Twin Towers. That is truly unusual, sort of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I savored it. Can we have slide 3, please? Okay, so this is not a very good image, and I apologize for that. But this is a view looking out from the 91st floor of the Twin Towers out towards, that's looking north in Manhattan, up towards the Empire State Building. When the Twin Towers were built in the 1970s, the developers anticipated a high demand for vertical office space. But as it turned out, by the turn of the millennium, a good deal of the rentable space, even on the upper floors, was vacant. A public cultural organization called the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council arranged with the building's operators to set aside some of the vacant space to be used as artist studios on a temporary basis. And I was fortunate enough to be the recipient of one of those studio spaces. Needless to say, the view from the 91st floor was incredible. Even as seen through the building's characteristically narrow windows, the visual tableau was endlessly fascinating. In fact, I found it very difficult to do any work there because all I wanted to do was look out the window and see the amazing view. And you can see here, this is how the windows were oriented in these sort of narrow vertical bands. And what I want to point out here is this shape actually is something I've reused in my work. Can we go to slide number 1, please? Just quickly. It's maybe hard to see, but I've sort of incorporated that visual motif in some of my work as a recapitulation of that image. Okay, can we go back forward to the other slide? Thank you. Actually, let's go one slide further. So this is just one more shot. That's me in the corner, not being very productive, and people hanging out on the windows. And you can see, you could sit right on the ledges and look right down into the cityscape. And it was an amazing view both night and day. And on a clear day, you could see very far. You could actually see to Pennsylvania. So, like I say, the view was so amazing that, you know, I didn't really get a lot of work done there, but it had a lasting effect on me, and that's an important thing for an artist because, and probably for any pursuit, is that some of the information you take in now, it might not resonate with you and manifest itself in some kind of product or action or concretized thought for a long time. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, that the experiences you gather as you go along in whatever your pursuit is, if it's art or music or academics, writing, those experiences need to percolate and they need to sort of gestate in you and come out possibly later. Well, the studio I have now in New Haven doesn't have an amazing view, so that's no longer a problem for me. So I'm able to get work done there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what I do as an artist primarily is make work from imagination. Work that uses references to nature and landscape and cartography and architecture and perspectival delineations of visual space. I'm interested in using the idea of nature with all of its sort of freighted baggage of sublime grandeur and all the things we think about when we talk about the idea of nature. I'm interested in using it as a character, so to speak, in my artwork. And this character has to contend with another character. And the second character is the cultural and material evidence of our world and the things that people make. The built environment, the buildings and bridges and straight lines and right angles and structures that we crisscross the planet with. These two characters exist in a sort of protagonist-antagonist dilemma. You'll be familiar with those terms from your literature classes, right? In a sort of hero-anti-hero dynamic, where one might dominate the other. However, in my work, it is nature that is a character of resurgent power and force, and nature that perforates the structures we build to contain and refute it. It punctures the organizational boundaries we erect to contain it and manage its seeming chaos. Can we get the next slide, please? Excuse me one second. So my idea about these two characters in conflict informs the way I draw and paint. In my work, nature is represented in a stylized way. I draw, typically in pencil, plant and botanical and plant-like forms, which to me, maybe to you as well, represent an idea of nature without troubling to depict a natural scene with optical fidelity. For me, this is graphically interesting and also expresses an idea of nature as ideology, as a thing of our imaginations, a tool for our self-description, something forever outside our full understanding. For indications of our built environment, the other character in this duality or binary opposition, I use clear geometric forms and systems of one-point perspective that assert a deep picture space and a sense of explosive force. And I think this image sort of clearly illustrates that. You can see how there's this suggestion of things force emanating out from a central point, almost like a Big Bang kind of point of location. There's a muted haze-like quality to the natural imagery in my work, an atmospheric quality, and I like this very much. But I often want to refute that hazy landscape, that atmospheric perspective feeling with clear shapes and strongly delineated, saturated color. This, in my painting, is the conflict of these two dynamic forces at work. These two elements play against each other and exchange places of dominance, one insurgent, the other resurgent, both in flux and both vying in their way for hegemony. Can I get the next slide, please? I make each work in layers, layers of thin, translucent paper on which I record different amounts of information, and I build up layer over layer. And I love this technique, although it's long and somewhat arduous, but I like it because it gives me a chance to be an editor as I go along, to sort of overlay each successive image one over the other and make decisions before committing to a change and making it permanent by gluing one layer to the other. Can I get the next slide? So I'm showing here an example of this process. This is sort of an aside. This is a base layer of information laid down here with a general sort of schema of what's going on in the image. Can I get the next one? And this is an overlay of more information done where you can sort of see how some areas are occluded, some are revealed, and these sort of subsequent layers have their own bits of information and they're layered on top. Next slide, please. And that's just another process shot in the studio. I like studio shots. I like looking at these little these work tables that I build as much as I like the work. Next slide, please. And I think that's the final piece. That piece is actually in the show, so you can take a look at it there and see the nuance with a little more clarity. So this is a type of visual accretion, a gradual coming together. It's kind of like an archaeological dig in reverse, where instead of finding out by uncovering, I'm finding out by accumulation and strategic decision, about superimposition, by thinking about what is occluded and what is revealed. And it may be hard to see these from the images, the interactions of each layer, the way each is individually articulated, and the way they come together as a whole. But if you, like I say, if you stop by the gallery, you can get a closer look at the real thing and see better how it works. So while this technique lacks in spontaneity, it offers access to a gradual cartography of my visual thinking. Each level or layer is like a map in its own way, literally crafting an image and metaphorically reflecting the geographic characteristics of the maps with which we conceptually regulate and order and picture the disorder of the natural realm we seek to dominate and exploit and often subdue. But no artwork exists in a vacuum, right? No artist exists in a vacuum. Everybody has influences. So I want to talk just briefly about a few of mine. So I've always been interested in and motivated by a number of visual artistic things, but key among them are the design elements of traditional Japanese landscape painting and the similar aesthetic expressions in Japanese and Korean painting traditions. Can I have the next slide, please? This is obviously blurry and not a great slide, and that's my fault. Can I get the next one? So these slides are just examples of what I mean, and I'll leave them unattributed in terms of authorship, but just understand they're all sort of pre-modern era, brush and ink on silk or paper. Next slide, please. And what I find so beautiful and compelling is the sparseness in the use of the picture space, the way the artist juxtaposes figure and ground such that so much information is left out and only hinted at, only suggested. It's for the viewer to conjure the rest, if that's what they want to do. We've all seen landscape in its limitless detail. No need to craft a representation with verisimilitude or optical fidelity. Instead, emphasis is placed, I believe, on expression. This is also, I think, a sense of the landscape as ideological force. So I want to link it to my own understanding of a schematized representation of landscape as a suggestion of landscape as a concept of ideology, rather than as a concept of something we're seeing and trying to depict with optical fidelity. And this is quite different from painting in the European tradition of a similar historical era, with its ruling paradigms of realism and perspective. So on the other hand, I've also been greatly influenced by early modernist expressions in painting and in the graphic arts. Expressions that reduce the visual information provided, use strong, declarative shapes, and convey dynamism and movement. Can I have the next slide? So here I have a few images, 3 images, by the Russian painter Kazimir Malevich from the early 20th century. This is modernism. And this is a move away from the older ways of representation towards so-called pure abstraction, non-objective painting. Next slide. Malevich is identified as part of an art historical moment, sometimes called suprematism, sometimes called constructivism. And what I like about these works, I like them really for 2 things. I like them as aesthetic objects, but also for their historical import. They're markers along the way, and we can trace progress of aesthetic development in our illustrational history, our painting history. We can use these markers to trace progress and see where we've come from and where we're going visually as a culture. I like how declarative they are and the sense of dynamic motion in them. Can I have the next slide? Clearly, this is machine-age imagery. It's imagery of that time. This kind of art needs the tools and mannerisms of the industrial as a model and the dynamic force of mechanical propulsion as a precursor. Next slide, please. This is my work that sort of, I think, combines my technique with a little more overt reference to the Malevichian saturated fields of color and bold geometric shapes. So that's a little bit about what I do as an artist and where it comes from, aesthetically, intellectually, etc. So that leaves the important matter of why I do it. Why make art and why bother? Because it's expensive, you have to rent a studio, materials, exhibitions, and all that stuff. So making art is very easy, and it's also very hard. It's both easy and hard at the same time, or at alternating times, in succession. But when you pursue it over the long term, it is work. It's work. It's commitment. It can feel like a chore that you want to turn away from, that you want relief from. Next slide, please. And the studio can be a place of quandary as much as a place of creative fulfillment. But it's important for me to make my work because if I don't, it won't exist. That is to say, I believe my work has enough specificity that I'm the only person who can do it, and if I don't do it, it won't be there. It won't materialize in the world in a very real sense. I won't know what it is. This may sound a bit circular and odd and obvious, that the thing that didn't exist before will never have existed until I find out what it is by bringing it into existence. But this is how I think of it. Like I said, it's circular. At least in the best moments, this is how I think of it. Can I have the next slide? But there's another thing. We live in a world saturated in visual and auditory stimulation, and increasingly in virtual stimulation. We have images and sounds all around us, and at all times, images from film and TV, music and advertising, the products and byproducts of our consumer culture. And what's amazing is the high quality of so much of this media. We have access to unparalleled amounts of high-quality stimulation that we can take in on a whim. And so seductive is all of this rich imagery and stimulation that we run the risk of being sucked into a posture of perpetual consumption, of always inhabiting someone else's narrative, of always being filled by images not of our own making. Next slide, please. That's really light. But that's why I think it's important to make things, to make art, to make music, to make poetry and prose or whatever, to make anything that reflects your specificity, your narrative. These things may not be seen or heard or read or experienced by others. They may be only for you, but in making them, you resist being solely a consumer of culture. You become a producer. Making art, or whatever creative product you choose, is an act of resistance. Resistance to a larger culture to which we are often enough relegated to a status of consumer. A culture that we often enough perceive as lacking something. Next slide, please. This is something that motivates me to continue. To make something born of my own specificity, born of your own specificity, is an act of resistance to perpetual consumption. Thank you.